Colin, what is it about consciousness that human beings have come up with every possible explanation for its fundamental nature? Certain religions and philosophers have had the world only be conscious. On the other hand, some philosophers would eliminate it totally. Some would make it a so-called epiphenomena, which it's real and it seems to be important, but it's just hanging on there. How do you look at the issue of the fundamental nature of consciousness?
It is one of the deepest problems in philosophy and increasingly in science, because there's always been the question, what's the most basic thing in the universe? Is it the mind, or is it things outside the mind? Mm-hmm. Sometimes it's God's mind, but let's not think about that at the moment. So idealism is the view that the reality is through and through mental, and what we think of as material things are just configurations of that spiritual, mental realm. And then at the other extreme, there's the idea there's only the material world, and consciousness is just an illusion. There's no such thing as consciousness to begin with. And then there are positions at every stage between those two extremes. So panpsychism is the view that consciousness is an ingredient of every entity in the world, including elementary particles, though it doesn't exhaust their nature. So an elementary particle will have some non-conscious properties, like spin or mass, as well as some conscious properties, like having a feeling of some sort, a very extraordinary view, of course. And then you've got views that say that consciousness and matter are equal ontological entities. This is more like Descartes' view. Neither is more fundamental than the other. They both are created independently. We don't know how, perhaps, but they're created independently, but they're equal in ontological status. Then you've got the idea that consciousness is real, but it depends completely on the material world, particularly on the body and on the brain. And then you've got the view that not only does the consciousness depend on the brain, but also it's completely reducible to the brain. That's more the materialist view. And you've got any other positions in between of those. Epiphenomenalism, you mentioned, is the idea that consciousness depends on the brain, and so is caused by events in the brain, but itself doesn't cause anything. And then you've got interactionism like Descartes, where consciousness does depend on the brain, but it also causes events in the brain, a two-way causal interaction. So you've got a vast variety of different positions, and the great difficulty is that all these positions seems defensible from its own point of view. You can give arguments for all of them, which is why great thinkers have subscribed to almost all these positions. And the difficulty is trying to see through all of that and arrive at the view which is best overall, which is hard.
So dealing with this fundamental question is the fundamental nature of consciousness. Is it reducible to something else? The view that you've taken, the so-called Mysterian view, which says that maybe the human mind is incapable of even knowing what the answer is, certainly in light of this diversity, is a legitimate position that has become of interest. You can see that with the number of the people who attack it shows how important it is.
Indeed. I distinguish, on the question of is consciousness reducible, I distinguish an epistemological and an ontological interpretation of that question.
And that means?
That means the epistemological interpretation is it's reducible to something which we now know. Mm-hmm. So we could, in principle, know what the reduction is. So it would be, for example, be the view that states of consciousness are reducible to rates of firing in neurons, because we know what rates of firing in neurons are. And so that's an epistemological reduction, because it's a reduction to something that we know. I think the answer to that is no, it's not reducible to anything that we know. But that doesn't, of course, imply it's not reducible to something we don't know. So that's left open. Now, there are those philosophers who think it's not reducible even to things we don't know. Descartes would have thought that, and idealists would think that, and even panpsychists would think that. I don't think that. My view is that consciousness is reducible to something about the brain, which is not itself consciousness, but we don't know what that thing is about the brain that it reduces to. So I hold out the possibility that consciousness is rooted wholly in the material world, the body and the brain, but its basis in that world is something which exceeds our cognitive limits.
Yeah, and you would, to be fair, have a much broader understanding of what the material world would be in order to include consciousness.
Yes. Well, one of the background issues here is the legitimacy of the use of the phrase the material world or materialism. So I don't suppose that the material world includes only what physics now or in the future will reveal to us. That's not the material world, because I don't think physics will reveal to us the basis of
that's a
consciousness.
very controversial statement, because you're saying it's not even what physics knows today that's non-controversial. But when you said even in the future, so you're defining the physical world, the material world, as including things beyond what physics can describe in the future.
Yes, beyond what physics can describe in the future, because physics is a human science. Physics results from our cognitive abilities as we apply them to the world, the natural world that we experience. Now, we've come very far in that, and let's take astronomy as part of physics just to bear that in mind. We've come remarkably far in understanding those things. But that there are limits to our understanding of the world in that mode doesn't imply that that's all there is to the world.
Sure,
so in the case of astronomy, it's very clear.
That's right.
In the case of astronomy, there may become a limit where we can't find out any more.
Certainly we're limited by the speed of light and the time it's taken, and so we can only look so far.
Right. But it would be a complete mistake to say that just because of that there were no facts about the astronomical world which exist outside of astronomy.
I think that's non-controversial. I think that's been agreed. I agree.
So similarly in physics, theoretical physics as it's understood, maybe the only theories we with our brains can ever develop are theories which cover only an aspect of physical reality, maybe aspects of physical reality which our brains can't reveal to us, but they're still physical. In fact, I even think that even in some of our most basic physics now, there are aspects even of electricity which our theories don't encompass now. So that even in the theory of electricity, there are physical unknowns which are part of a physical reality which are not included within physics.
So extrapolating from this to what consciousness may truly be in its deep essence, its ontological, its real being, what would that imply about the fundamental nature of consciousness if you need to bring in something from an area of the material world that in principle the human mind could never even determine? What would that say about consciousness?
Well, it would say that its intrinsic reality, its basic essence, is something which transcends our ability to grasp it. There's something about it which our minds are unable to grasp. But I don't think that's terribly surprising, because I think, as I was hinting a moment ago, I think it's true even of some basic physics. There are things in those areas which our mind doesn't grasp, and it's not clear that we can, even what matter is, or what electricity is. In physics, this is a view which has been around for quite a long time, but in physics, what we have are theories which describe the structural or dispositional properties or formal properties of physical systems. They don't really tell you the intrinsic nature of the entities in these systems. So in the theory of electromagnetism, you've got this word, it's been introduced, electricity. It denotes something called a force. The force is known only by its effects in producing motion in objects, but through attraction or repulsion. But if you ask, what's the intrinsic nature of electricity? A physics textbook doesn't tell you. It just says, here's what electricity does. It acts across these distances. These are the laws that govern it. If you want to know, but what is it? Physics book doesn't tell you. So if physics can get by with these mysteries, these areas in which there's ignorance of the nature of things, it shouldn't be all that surprising. The consciousness itself is something in its nature mysterious.
Would that make consciousness something that's fundamental to the world, as something that, in essence, you couldn't have a world without it? Or is it something that has accidentally come into it as a byproduct of other things?
Yeah.
Can we?
Well, since, according to me, we're so ignorant of consciousness, it's hard to answer a question like that. But I think we can reasonably believe that consciousness is not a fundamental aspect of the world. So it could have been that after the Big Bang, you've got all the particles there, and the forces are in operation, the physical laws obtain, but no consciousness ever evolved. And there was no consciousness then, and there was no consciousness later. That seems to be a conceivable world. Not every world has got consciousness in it. Mm-hmm. So our world might have been a world in which there was no consciousness. So I'm opposed to the idealist view, or the panpsychist view, or the view which has been around for a long time, that the physical world itself is somehow inherently spiritual. And people think, well, there's energy and there's movement, that's like the will, so there's some spirituality in it. I don't think that at all. I think that consciousness arises from matter in some way. It's just that the way in which it arises isn't a way that we can understand. But it seems to me incontestable that consciousness arises in some way from the material world. So evolution occurred, and somehow, when brains evolved, consciousness came along with it. So it seems to me that that's the way things are. And on that view, of course, consciousness is not a fundamental aspect of the world.